Hello, my friends. Everybody keeps a straight face in front of the cameras with the United States. They smile, they pose, they talk about unity, but behind closed doors, the tone is very different. In private key, European leaders are now admitting something they would never say publicly. They fear the United States is preparing to betray Ukraine, to walk away from the project they helped launch, and to leave Vladimir Zelensky alone with realities he cannot control. They talk about big dangers for him. They talk about games being played with both you and us. And yet, for all their theatrical shock, none of this is surprising. In fact, it is the entirely predictable endgame of a cynical Western policy that has used Ukraine as a disposable proxy in a geopolitical contest with Russia. Let's start with this word betrayal. To betray someone, there has to be a genuine commitment in the first place, a binding promise, a shared understanding, some kind of marriage of interests. Under the current U.S. administration, that simply does not exist. Since Trump came into office, Washington has not made concrete, formal commitments to Ukraine or Europe that could realistically be betrayed. The real commitments, the ones that mattered, were made earlier under Biden's presidency. Political guarantees, rhetorical assurances, and a constant drumbeat that turned the Ukrainian war into the moral and political centerpiece of his re-election narrative. Remember how Joe Biden sold himself in 2023. His core re-election message featured him as a wartime president striding through Kyiv. The underlying claim was simple: re-elect Biden to secure democracy in Ukraine and defeat Russia. The war wasn't a peripheral issue. It was put forward as a fundamental pillar of his legitimacy. Ukrainians heard that, Europeans heard that. Every elite in Kyiv and Brussels built expectations around it. Add to that years of speeches, visits, sanctions packages, and we will stand with you as long as it takes pronouncements. And you can understand why Ukraine's leadership might have believed Washington would never back down. But behind those speeches lies the real pattern of U.S. behavior, which has nothing to do with loyalty and everything to do with cold self-interest. From the beginning of this conflict, there was a peaceful settlement available. A deal was on the table in early 2022. It could have stopped the bloodshed. Instead, Western officials, Boris Johnson, Lloyd Austin, and others, went to Kyiv and told Zelensky not to sign. Don't compromise. Don't negotiate. We'll give you everything you need to win. You'll be the new Churchill. You'll be the hero of the age. It was pure fantasy, but it was fantasy with deadly consequences because it locked Ukraine into a war it could not win against a nuclear-armed Russia that would not back down on core security interests. This isn't an aberration. It's standard operating procedure for Washington. Henry Kissinger put it bluntly: it is dangerous to be America's enemy, but fatal to be its ally. Vietnam learned that. Afghanistan learned that. I said at the start of this conflict that Ukrainians would eventually be treated like Afghans, a proxy force used until it no longer serves U.S. interests, then abandoned once the political calculus in Washington changes. That is exactly what is happening. And the betrayal isn't primarily of European elites or even of Zelensky personally. The real betrayal is of the Ukrainian people themselves, bled on the battlefield to serve a geopolitical experiment in weakening Russia that never had any realistic chance of succeeding. European leaders like Macron and Merz now whisper to each other that Zelensky faces great danger. But what danger? Are they talking about his physical safety, whether Western intelligence services or some other actor might remove him if he resists a settlement? Or are they warning him that if he accepts a deal, the ultranationalist, far-right militias, and neo-Nazi elements inside Ukraine will view him as a traitor and come for him themselves? Because that is not speculation. When Zelensky came to power, he was elected on a platform of ending the civil war in Donbass and honoring the Minsk agreements. The moment he tried to move toward peace with Russia, the hard right reminded him of the tree they planned to hang him from if he did. That threat has not gone away. If Zelensky agrees to a negotiated settlement that includes territorial concessions, something any realistic deal he will be seen by these forces as the man who lost parts of Ukraine and surrendered to Russia. And those groups are not a marginal fringe. Over the last decade, especially through the war, they have gained power, armed strength, and organizational capacity. They are precisely the factions best positioned to carry out a coup or an assassination and then hold a government together by brute force. You don't need to invent a US or British plot to see the danger. It's already embedded in Ukraine's own internal political landscape. And of course, one can never rule out the involvement, encouragement, or facilitation of services like MI6 in such scenarios. This is how empire operates. So what about the idea that Washington might remove Zelensky in order to secure peace with Russia? Here the logic starts to break down. The problem is succession. If the United States were to push him into exile or have him exit feet first, who comes next? Who in Ukraine has the political legitimacy, support, and coercive power to manage a deeply controversial settlement while holding the state together? The Americans can topple regimes. They've proven that repeatedly. What they cannot do is reliably install a stable, legitimate successor in a fractured, traumatized country at the end of a lost war. That's why the real immediate danger to Zelensky comes from his nationalist flank, not from Washington's need for a convenient scapegoat. At a deeper level, the core problem is that no one in this process is truly trustworthy. Every major player, the Americans, the Europeans, Kiev's leadership, even Russia, acts from self-interest. All of them have lied. All of them have broken promises. And the only solid guide to reality is not what they claim, but what is happening on the ground. Right now, on that battlefield, Russia is dominant. It is winning. That matters. Because when you are winning a war, you actually have the option to tell the truth. You don't need to hide behind fantasy narratives about imminent victory and fortress democracy. You can simply state your aims and show the world that events are steadily bending in your favor. That is why, today, Russian public statements about the war often come closer to reality than the delusional rhetoric coming out of Washington, London, or Brussels. That doesn't mean Moscow never lies before the February 2022 operation. Russian officials denied they would invade even as forces moved into position. But once the conflict began, Russia's description of battlefield trends, Western involvement, and its own objectives has generally tracked far more closely with facts than the West's propaganda about Ukrainian advances, Russian collapse, or Putin's imminent fall. Europe and the US have spent years reinforcing narratives that are now obviously false, yet they lack any graceful way to back away from them. Their credibility is shot, but they are politically trapped by their own story. Look at Europe's leadership class. These are not confident, popular statesmen. They are weak, beleaguered politicians presiding over declining economies, deindustrialization, uncontrolled migration, housing crises, crumbling public services, and growing public anger. Their approval ratings are dismal, often in the teens or low 20s. To compensate, they have wrapped their political identity in the flag of resisting Russian aggression and defending liberal democracy against autocracy. They cast themselves as the heirs of their grandfathers who fought fascism, standing bravely against a new Hitler in the Kremlin. When you have tied your entire legitimacy to that kind of narrative, how do you walk away from it? How do you suddenly admit that Russia is not marching on Paris, that Ukraine cannot win, and that some version of Russia's security demands will have to be accepted? That is the heart of the European dilemma. They cannot deliver real material improvements at home. They cannot sustain the war effort without the United States. But they also cannot easily renounce the crusade they've built their reputations on. So they default to spoiling tactics, seeking to block or complicate any settlement that doesn't allow them to save face. They posture about justice, borders, and maximalist demands while lacking the money, the weapons, or the industrial base to change the situation on the battlefield. All they can do is delay the inevitable and raise the cost in Ukrainian lives. Against this backdrop, the Western establishment insists that Russia can never be trusted. We hear endlessly that Moscow has violated every agreement it ever signed. This mantra serves a purpose. It justifies refusing any compromise and preemptively delegitimizes any peace deal that might reflect Russia's actual leverage. But if we step back and look at the record, it is the United States and its allies who have systematically shredded treaties when they become inconvenient, withdrawing from the INF Treaty, abandoning open skies, violating or walking away from the JCPOA with Iran, and openly admitting that the Minsk agreements were never meant to be implemented, only to buy time to arm Ukraine. Add to that the original sin, the broken promise to Gorbachev, that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. That is not Russian propaganda. Former Western leaders themselves have acknowledged it. Russia has taken note of all this. So when Western officials say, "We can't trust anything," Russia says, Moscow looks at the track record of American and European behavior from Afghanistan to Iran to Ukraine and concludes that it is the West that cannot be trusted to honor its word. For Russia, any negotiated settlement now must be grounded not in trust, but in hard self-interest. The only reason for Moscow to sign anything is if the deal locks in strategic gains, reduces long-term risk, and serves Russia's national security objectives in a tangible way. The good news, from their perspective, is that they are in a position of strength. That gives them options. And contrary to the propaganda about Russian maximalist goals, the emerging peace proposals we've heard about are not some total capitulation to Moscow. Western media tells us this 28-point plan is basically written by Russia because it satisfies all of Putin's alleged ambitions. That's nonsense. In reality, these proposals do not grant immediate sanctions relief, which Russia wants. They envision Ukrainian troop withdrawals and demilitarized zones in parts of Donetsk and Luhansk, with de facto, not de jure, Russian control in some areas. They contemplate limited, informal recognition of Russian authority in the annexed regions, not the full legal recognition Moscow has asked for. They allow Zelensky's government to remain in power and require elections instead of installing a new regime acceptable to Russia. In other words, the plan is a compromise and, from a strictly Russian perspective, an incomplete one. The maximalist label collapses even further if you recall what Western leaders told their own populations the last 4 years, that Russia wanted to conquer all of Ukraine, then roll on to Warsaw, Berlin, and beyond, and that if we don't fight them there, we'll fight them in the streets of Philadelphia. Now, those same people are screaming that a settlement leaving Russia in control of some territory in Donbass and other regions is somehow the full realization of Moscow's grand imperial design. They can't have it both ways. Either Russia's war aim was always limited to secure its borders, neutralize Ukraine, and resolve the Donbass question, or the current deal, far from being maximalist, represents a significant reduction of what they claimed Russia sought. So, where does this leave us in the near term? The United States and Russia have held long, serious talks in Moscow. Publicly, nothing concrete has been announced beyond vague statements about productive discussions, but that's typical. Real diplomacy happens offstage. Meanwhile, Europe scrambles to stay relevant, threatening moves like trying to seize frozen Russian assets in Belgium. Even here, cracks are appearing. The Belgian Prime Minister has openly warned that stealing Russian state funds would be illegal, deeply dangerous, and would sabotage any chance of peace by convincing Moscow that the West cannot be negotiated with at all. In other words, even within Europe, some leaders understand that their own colleagues are behaving like spoilers, not peacemakers. Ukraine, for its part, is slowly, reluctantly colliding with reality. The people they've sent to negotiations, the tone of their public messaging, and the desperate appeals for continued U.S. support all signal the same fact. They know the Americans are serious about walking away. They know the Europeans can't replace Washington. They know they cannot reverse battlefield trends. So Kyiv faces a grim choice. Accept a settlement that codifies territorial losses and shatters the myth of inevitable victory, or refuse and risk total collapse later under even worse conditions. From Russia's vantage point, there are strong reasons to entertain a settlement now. The war is going in their favor. They've secured key strategic objectives. The Ukrainian army is exhausted. Western arsenals are depleted. But no serious Russian strategist believes war is predictable. Even a favorable conflict carries risks, unexpected escalations, internal strains, the possibility, however small, of direct NATO involvement, ending the war under terms that reflect Russia's gains while shifting resources back into civilian development, rearmament under calmer conditions, and long-term strategic competition with the West is an attractive prospect. It also opens space for a broader grand bargain. Limitations on NATO presence near Russian borders, constraints on USS, missile systems in Poland and Romania, and a framework that reduces the risk of a future NATO-Russia war, the very catastrophe Moscow sought to prevent when it launched this operation. The real question inside Russia is political. Does Vladimir Putin have enough capital to sell such a deal at home? The pressure on him comes not from liberals, but from nationalists who believe the war should have been prosecuted more aggressively from the start. They see any compromise as insufficient. Yet the war remains broadly popular in Russia, and Putin's own standing is high, precisely because he is seen as defending the nation against an encroaching NATO, not chasing imperial fantasies. If he can present the settlement as a clear victory, a neutralized Ukraine, NATO pushed back, security strengthened, he can likely carry the argument. On the Ukrainian side, the political and personal risks for Zelensky are enormous. To sign is to risk being branded a traitor by the very forces he empowered. To refuse is to preside over further military disaster and possibly the collapse of the Ukrainian state itself. Does he have the sense and the courage to take the least bad option? Will the Americans quietly offer him a path to survival, perhaps exile or some carefully choreographed transition, to make the pill easier to swallow? If they do not, his incentives to stall and gamble with his country's future increase, and hovering over all of this is the Trump factor. Whatever anyone thinks of him, one thing is clear. He loves spectacle. He craves the stage. If he believes that announcing a peace deal over Ukraine can give him a historic moment, say, a dramatic Christmas Eve proclamation of war ended, he will push his team and every participant in this process to deliver something he can brand as his triumph. That doesn't guarantee a just or stable settlement, but it does inject time pressure and political urgency into an already volatile mix. So we arrive at a stark, uncomfortable truth. The betrayal of Ukraine did not begin when the United States started talking about peace. It began when Washington, London, and Brussels encouraged Kyiv to reject a winnable early settlement, armed it for a war it could not win, and sold its people a fantasy of total victory over Russia. It continued when they treated Ukrainian lives as expendable in the pursuit of a strategic hallucination that Russia could be bled, broken, and humiliated into submission. Now that this hallucination has crashed into reality, the same elites who created the mess are scrambling to avoid responsibility, whispering about danger, betrayal, and unacceptable terms. Russia, for its part, has been remarkably consistent about its core demands. An end to NATO's military encroachment, recognition de facto or de jure of its control over key territories, and a security architecture that does not leave a hostile NATO-armed Ukraine on its border. It has proven willing to negotiate, as shown by past deals over grain exports and prisoner exchanges, and by the early 2022 talks that were sabotaged by the West. Now, with a strategic advantage, Moscow can afford to talk again, but only on terms that reflect the new balance of power. The tragedy is that none of this had to happen. A neutral Ukraine, a federal solution for Donbass, and a genuine European security arrangement that respected Russia's red lines were all possible years ago. That path was rejected because Western elites preferred ideology over realism, narrative over facts, and proxies over peace. Today, as the war grinds toward its final phase, the choice is no longer between justice and compromise, but between an imperfect settlement now or a far worse outcome later. The Ukrainian people will pay the highest price either way. But in strategic terms, Russia has already achieved most of what it set out to secure. That is the uncomfortable, inexorable reality the West is still struggling to admit.